Assalamu alaikum. I'm Professor Dr. Hayder Mubarak. I will present the fourth lecture in anatomy of the thorax, and it is about the pericardium. The pericardium, as it is shown in this figure, is a sac which contains the heart and the root of great vessels. This sac is formed of an outer fibrous tissue, and inside it is a serous membrane, just like the pleura, and so it is called a fibroserous sac. In order to describe the anatomy of the pericardium, I have to revise subdivision of the mediastinal cavity. In the previous lecture we had said that the thoracic cavity is formed of right and left pleural cavities, and in the middle are many structures, trachea, esophagus, great vessels and heart, that is forming part of the thoracic cavity, which is called mediastinum, that are lying in the middle of the thoracic cavity. Anatomically, we can divide this middle cavity, the mediastinum, by an imaginary line extending horizontally from the sternal angle of Lewis back to the intervertebral disc between T4 and T5 vertebra. This is the sternal angle between the manubrium and body of sternum, and this is the disc between T4 and T5, and we may draw an imaginary line, a horizontal imaginary line in between the sternal angle and the disc between T4 and T5. This imaginary line divides the cavity of the mediastinum, which is the cavity containing all these structures, trachea, esophagus, heart and great vessels, into a part above this imaginary line, which is called superior mediastinum, and a larger part which is below this imaginary line, which is called the inferior mediastinum. And this inferior mediastinum is considered to be formed of three parts. The heart and pericardium is considered as the middle of the inferior mediastinum, and the region between the body of sternum and the heart and pericardium, this is the anterior part of inferior mediastinum, while the part behind the heart and pericardium is the posterior part of the inferior mediastinum. And that's why in anatomy we say that the inferior mediastinum below the imaginary line is dividing by the pericardium into anterior, middle and posterior mediastinum. The anterior mediastinum is anterior to the pericardium, and the posterior mediastinum is behind the pericardium. The pericardium itself is the middle mediastinum. So as it is written here, that the pericardium lies in the middle mediastinum. And because of the structure of the pericardium, which is formed of an outer fibrous tissue lined from inside by membrane, which is serous membrane, so we have to say that the pericardium is formed of two parts, outer fibrous and inner serous. This figure shows the outer fibrous pericardium, and you can see that this outer fibrous pericardium fuses with the root of great vessels, and this fusion occurs between the fibrous pericardium and the vessels superiorly, so that you cannot separate these the vessels from the fibrous pericardium easily. And also the fibrous pericardium fuses also with the diaphragm below, and you cannot separate the fibrous pericardium from the diaphragm easily. And even the heart could move with the diaphragm During respiration, the heart descends down during inspiration and ascends up during expiration. Actually, the pericardium fuses with the central tendon of the diaphragm. And also the heart, the pericardium, the fibrous pericardium, is attached anteriorly to the body of sternum by a ligament which is called sternopericardial ligament. To inside of the fibrous pericardium, just look to this magnified drawing. This is the fibrous pericardium. To the inside of it is a membrane, which is serous membrane, just like the pleura, which is called serous pericardium. And similar also to the pleura, this serous layer of pericardium is described to be formed of two layers: parietal layer lining the fibrous pericardium, and a serous layer which is covering the heart, and firmly adherent to the heart. And the space between the parietal layer of the serous pericardium and visceral layer of serous pericardium, this space is called pericardial cavity, which is a potential cavity that is filled with thin amount of fluid to facilitate the movement of the heart during contraction. This drawing represents the inside of the parietal serous pericardium, and it representing a figure in which the heart had been removed with the visceral layer of pericardium covering it. If you remember this figure here, we had removed the heart, and with the heart the visceral layer of serous pericardium had been removed. Don't forget that the visceral layer of serous pericardium sometimes is called as epicardium. So the next figure, which is this one, the heart and epicardium, the visceral pericardium, the visceral serous pericardium, had been removed. So you can see that there are spaces forming the so-called sinuses of serous pericardium. These sinuses or spaces representing the continuity between the folds or the reflections of continuity between the visceral serous pericardium and parietal serous pericardium. So just like the reflections of the pleura, here we also have reflections between the visceral serous and the visceral parietal to form spaces or sinuses. The first space to be described is the transverse sinus, which is this one. It is defined as the space between the reflections of the visceral and serous pericardium around the great arteries and veins. So this is the ascending aorta, and this is the pulmonary trunk. Both of these are arteries, and this is the superior vena cava and pulmonary veins. So you can see that this sinus lies between the aorta and pulmonary trunk as arteries, and superior vena cava and pulmonary veins as great veins, and it is a transverse sinus. While the other sinus is this one, which is called oblique pericardial sinus. It is a space also lying at the reflection of continuity between the visceral and serous pericardium, and it is surrounding it is surrounded by the vena cava and the four pulmonary veins. And also it lies, the oblique pericardial sinus lies behind the heart, behind the left atrium of the heart. Just like the nerve supply of the pleura, nerve supply of the pericardium is by the fibrous layer of pericardium and the parietal layer of serous pericardium are supplied by the phrenic nerve, and you know the phrenic nerve run on the sides of the fibrous pericardium, and it is a branch from the cervical plexus. The root value is C3, C4, C5. So the fibrous pericardium and the parietal serous pericardium are pain sensitive. The heart has borders and surfaces. If you want to describe the borders of the heart, we have to look to the heart from the anterior aspect. And this is the anterior aspect of the heart. So on that aspect, we can see that the heart has a right border, which is formed by the right atrium, a left border, which is mainly formed by the left ventricle, but above a small region of the left border is formed by the auricle of the left atrium, pointed here as left auricle, and an inferior border which is formed mostly by the right ventricle and in a small region near the apex by the left ventricle. And you can see that the apex of the heart is the corner between the left border and right border. It is the apex of the heart is formed by the left ventricle, of course. And therefore, we had described the borders of the heart in terms of looking to the heart from the front, from the anterior surface. That lead us to surfaces of the heart. And as you know, this surface, therefore, is the anterior surface. It is formed by the right atrium, by the right ventricle, and by the left ventricle and the auricle of the left atrium. And this surface, of course, is related anteriorly to the sternum. That's why sometimes it is called the sternocostal surface, because it is related anteriorly to the sternum and costal cartilages. The green vertical imaginary line drawn here refers to the midline of the thorax. You can see that the 1/3 of the heart lies on the right side of the midline, while the other 2/3 of the heart lies at the left side of the midline. So this is the first surface, which is the sternocostal anterior surface. The inferior surface, which is sometimes called diaphragmatic surface because it is related to the diaphragm, is formed largely by the left ventricle, and the small region here is formed by the right ventricle. So this is the inferior surface. Third, the posterior surface is formed by the left auricle, the left atrium, and the 4 pulmonary veins. The posterior surface, or the base of the heart, is formed by the left atrium, which is this one, and the 4 pulmonary veins, the base of the heart, or the posterior surface. Surface anatomy of the heart is also an important subject in clinical practice. From the anterior aspect, you may draw the borders of the heart, the right border, the left border, and the inferior border on the chest wall by joining the following points. Starting with the right border. The right border, which is this one, is drawn by a curved line extending from the right 3rd costal cartilage to the right 6th costal cartilage. This curved line is just at the sternal border. And the inferior border, which is this one, is drawn by a line joining the right 6 costal cartilage, which is the lower end of the right border, with the 5th intercostal, a point in the 5th intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line. And this point, the at the 5th intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line, is the apex of the heart. Above it is the left border, which is extending from the 5th, from the point at the 5th intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line up to the second left costal cartilage, 2 centimeters from the sternum. So by these lines we can draw the surface anatomy of the borders of the heart on the chest wall. This is a CT scan for transverse section into the thoracic cage, showing the 4 chambers of the heart: the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle. You have to be familiar with the looking of the heart in transverse section, because CT scan is a very important test nowadays. All sectional anatomy images are of clinical significance in clinical practice. And this is a chest X-ray, posterior-anterior chest X-ray, demonstrating many structures that are of clinical significance. And here are the key referring to the numbers of these structures, and you need to know these structures. I don't need to enumerate them. The next topic is fibrous skeleton. The heart is formed of a muscle which is called myocardium. The muscles of the heart are attached to a fibrous tissue inside the heart that looks just like that, which is called fibrous skeleton. You can see that the fibrous skeleton of the heart is formed of 4 rings that surround the major valves: a ring around the pulmonary valve of the pulmonary trunk, a ring around the aortic valve of the ascending aorta, and a ring around the mitral valve, which is between the left ventricle, between the left atrium and ventricle, and a ring around the tricuspid valve, which is between the right atrium and right ventricle. And also there is a fibrous tissue in the upper part of the interventricular septum, which is referred to as membranous interventricular septum. This fibrous skeleton of the heart functions for the following. Number 1, it to provide support to the valves of the heart and the great vessels, and it to provide tissue for attachment of the myocardial muscles of the heart. And this fibrous skeleton acts as an electrical insulator between the right and left atria and the right and left ventricle, so that, as you will see later on, the electrical impulses from the atria could not pass from the atria into the ventricle unless passing through a specific bundle, which is called AV bundle. Thank you very much.